Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and we are now in the muscular system. So if you're still reading along in your book, we're now in chapter 6. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Muscles are responsible for all types of body movement. The essential function of the muscular system is contraction. And normally when we think of the muscular system, we're specifically talking about skeletal muscles, but there are some other muscle tissue that comes into play as well. So the three basic muscle tissue types that are found are going to be skeletal. And in this chapter we're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue, but you also have cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And hopefully those should be a review from a couple chapters ago, but really we'll go through cardiac when we go through the cardiovascular system, and then we'll go through smooth muscle in the urinary and digestive system a little bit more than this chapter. So the muscular system, we're really talking about skeletal muscle. Okay, so some muscle characteristics. Skeletal muscle and smooth muscle cells are elongated. Also, you can use this, you can say muscle cell, or you could say muscle fiber. Those mean the same things. Most of the time, we'll call them muscle fibers. I'll try to use both of them. And then contraction of muscles is due to the movement of microfilaments. Micro, hopefully you know, means small, and then filaments, there's going to be a whole bunch of little small things that we'll actually talk about in detail in a couple of podcasts from now, but that's how we get muscles to actually contract. And then all muscles share some similar terminology. That terminology are things like myo, and mys refers to muscle, and then sarco refers to flesh. So those are a couple of little indicators that if you see those words on an exam, hopefully you'll be able to identify that we're talking about the muscular system when you use those prefixes. Okay, so these are just diagrams that came directly from your textbook, but I just thought they were pretty important to have in there. So the skeletal muscle, remember, it is going to have striations. The cardiac muscle also has striations, but it's involuntary. Smooth muscle, there's no striations, but it's also involuntary. Okay. Then it goes on to talk about how different connective tissue is wrapped around muscle fibers, and we're actually going to talk in detail about this: paramecium, epimecium, and endomecium. Cardiac muscle has endomecium, smooth muscle has endomecium. And let's go ahead and talk about each of the muscle characteristics. If you remember all of this stuff from, I think it was chapter 3, you don't need to write everything down, but be aware that you will be responsible for knowing it for your next exam. So skeletal muscles, most skeletal muscles are attached by tendons to bones. These cells are multinucleate, meaning they have more than one nucleus per cell. They're also striated. Those were those banding pictures that we saw. To me, it makes them look like an earthworm, something kind of like that. They have a bunch of striations. And skeletal muscle is under voluntary control. So this is under conscious control. These skeletal muscle cells are known as fibers, as I told you a little bit ago. So cells are surrounded and bundled by connective tissue. So what that means is you don't just have your muscle cells just linked together. You have connective tissue that helps protect it. So cells are surrounded and bundled by connective tissue. The first one here is endomecium, encloses a single muscle fiber. So if we have a fiber here, the endomecium is going to surround the one single fiber. Paramecium is going to wrap around a fascicle, which we should probably, I have a picture of this. It'll be much better than my drawing. So paramecium wraps around a fascicle. A fascicle is just a bundle of muscle fibers. So if you have a bunch of muscle fibers and they're all enclosed by endomecium, then collectively you're going to end up getting this big circle of all of these. Okay, then the paramecium is what would surround the bundle or the fascicle. And then the epimecium covers the entire skeletal muscle. So you're going to have a whole bunch of these that are surrounded, and then eventually the whole thing is going to be surrounded by the epimecium. This is a terrible picture, so let's go ahead and just look at the diagram. Much better here. Okay, so we have our muscle cell or our fiber, which is right here. Okay, you'll notice that each of these muscle fibers are going to be wrapped around, so I guess let me erase this here. So the muscle fiber, just look at it from this top part that I colored in. It's encased in or wrapped by is going to be the endomysium, which is down here. Okay, so the endomysium is there. Okay, then you have a whole bunch of those fibers that are collected together, and then it becomes a fascicle. So you see you have several fascicles. That's a fascicle, this is a fascicle. So all of these become fascicles, okay? The fascicles are wrapped by paramecium. So then each fascicle has its own connective tissue layer called paramecium. Then once you have that all of those fascicles are bundled together as well. Those bundled fascicles then are going to be bundled by this epimecium. So this is this outermost layer here. Okay, it's kind of see-through-ish to me. Okay, so it's all of this layer right here. This is kind of confusing. Please make sure that you actually go through and spend a lot of time learning each of these layers. And then let's not forget about the blood vessels. So you're going to have several blood vessels in between each fascicle and that sort of thing as well. Remember, these are all, I guess before we move on, these are all types of connective tissue. So these are connective tissue wrappings. Okay, so some skeletal muscle attachment. The epimecium blends into connective tissue attachments. So that means, let me actually go back really quick. Okay, so that means if you're looking at, okay, so if you're looking at the epimecium, which is right here, at some point that epimecium or that connective tissue is going to connect with something like a tendon, for example. So the epimecium blends into a different connective tissue attachment. The first example are tendons. The way that you can tell the difference between tendons and then the second one are the aponeuroses is that tendons look like cords, okay? They look sort of like rope-like. And then the aponeuroses are flat and sheet-like. So you have aponeuroses in your skull, you have aponeuroses in your hand and in your feet. Tendons are cord-like structures. They're made mostly of collagen fibers, and they often cross a joint due to the toughness and their small size. So when it means that they cross a joint, that means that tendons are very tough. They're not going to break easily. They're not going to rupture. Can you imagine if you just had muscle cells connecting or skeletal muscle cells connecting from the actual muscle and attaching across a joint? It would probably rip and break and it'd be very fragile. So these tendons, these connective tissue, are very tough and they don't break when you move. Then aponeuroses are those sheet-like structures, and they attach muscles indirectly to bones, cartilage, or other connective tissue coverings. The major difference between these is that the tendon is cord-like, as you can see right there, that's the Achilles tendon. And then we have the aponeuroses that looks more sheet-like. It's spread out and it's very flat. And then our last slide for this podcast, at least, the sites for muscle attachment. So what kind of places do muscles attach? So muscles are going to attach to bones, cartilage, and other connective tissue coverings. And actually, I think we have one more. Oh, we have a couple more. Sorry, I'm a little off here. Okay, so smooth muscle characteristics. I'm going to fly through these because we've already talked about these in a couple of chapters previously. So smooth muscle lacks striations. They're spindle-shaped. They contain a single nucleus. They're involuntary, which means they have no conscious control. And then they're found mainly in the walls of hollow organs. And they're in layers of one circular layer to one longitudinal layer. And they're going to take care of the housekeeping activities. Housekeeping are going to be things like maintenance of the digestive system, the urinary system. It's going to do all of the housekeeping things that you don't have to worry about. Okay, so here's a diagram of our smooth muscle. So we have our circular layer, which you can see all of these cells go in a circle. And then we have the longitudinal layer. Okay, that's going to help for better movement, just the arrangement of those muscles, or of those cells, I guess. Then we have cardiac muscle characteristics. They're striated, single nucleus. They're branching cells. They're joined to other muscle cells at intercalated discs. And they're also involuntary. They're found only in the heart. And then they have cardiac fibers that are cushioned by small amounts of endomysium. So do you remember what endomysium is? Hopefully remember that you have individual muscle fibers, and those individual muscle fibers are surrounded by endomysium. And lastly here, we're actually going to go down to our next slide. You can also see that the cardiac muscle is also shaped in a figure-8 type pattern, which you saw from last slide. So it's arranged in a figure-8 pattern, so it's a little bit different from the smooth muscle and also from the skeletal muscle. Here we're finally at our last slide. Sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. So the major functions of the skeletal muscle is to produce movement, maintain posture, stabilize joints, and then generate heat. And again, when we're talking about the muscular system, if we say muscular system consists mostly of, you should be looking at something about skeletal muscle. Okay, so even though there's 3 different tissue types, our focus is going to be skeletal muscle.